Hi everyone, hope you're all well. And on the 420th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's death, which falls today, I normally release the episodes on Sunday, but this one's come out as a special edition for the anniversary. And we look at the famous Armada portrait here that we saw in part 1, all the way back in the beginning bit of part 1 of the video. The famous Armada portrait painted to celebrate the victory of the English over the Spanish Armada. That's Queen Elizabeth in all her glory. The Spanish Armada lasted from late May to August 1588. What really sparked the Armada off, and sparked King Philip here off into the Armada, were several things. Continual attacks by English pirates upon Spanish shipping, which was pissing them off really badly, and we stole a tremendous amount of wealth from them. But what really sparked King Philip and several other Catholic kings and monarchs off was, firstly, the death of Mary Queen of Scots on the 8th of February 1587. I say death, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots at Fotheringay Castle. Elizabeth, in many eyes, especially the Catholic ones, was never forgiven for this act, and they saw Mary, many people saw Mary, as a martyr. So yeah, that's the first thing that set the raging bull off, shall we say. The second thing was Sir Francis Drake, we've got to thank for this one. Drake's attack on Cadiz on the 12th of April in 1587. So yeah, that's really what set King Philip of Spain off. The Spanish Armada, aka the Enterprise of England, sailed from Lisbon in late May 1588, commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, this man here. He was an aristocrat without previous naval experience, appointed by King Philip II of Spain. His orders were to sail up the English Channel, link up with the Duke of Parma in Flanders, Duke of Parma that you can see here, and escort an invasion force that would land in England and overthrow Elizabeth I. Its purpose was to reinstate Catholicism in England, end support for the Dutch Republic, and prevent attacks by English and Dutch privateers against Spanish interests in the Americas. The Spanish were opposed by an English fleet based in Plymouth, commanded by Lord Charles Howard, High Admiral of England, who you can see here, and the famous Sir Francis Drake, courtier, explorer and pirate. This is a contemporary portrait of Drake of around the time of the Armada. He became a very famous man after that point. I've tried to use a lot of contemporary images where possible in the documentary because I just prefer that. I mean, Drake really did become a very, very famous man. The Spanish were opposed by an English fleet based in Plymouth, as I say, commanded by Drake. The English fleet, being far more manoeuvrable than the larger Spanish galleons, were able to attack the Armada as it sailed up the channel. Several subordinates advised Medina Sidonia to anchor in the Solent and to occupy the Isle of Wight, but he refused to deviate from his instructions to link up with Parma. Although the Armada reached Calais largely intact, while awaiting communication from Parma, it was attacked at night by English fire ships and forced to scatter. The Armada suffered further losses in the ensuing battle of Gravelines and was in danger of running aground on the Dutch coast when the wind changed, allowing it to escape into the North Sea. Pursued by the English, the Spanish ships returned home via Scotland and Ireland. Up to 24 ships were wrecked along the way before the rest managed to get home. The main battle and defeat was fought on the 8th of August 1588. The British Navy defeated the Spanish Armada at the Battle of Gravelines at the coast of France. And there we see the famous Armada portrait again, and there's very symbolic this portrait, and there's a lot of symbolism and hidden meanings and stuff in it. Over to, this is the great Queen herself, of course, Elizabeth. Over to the left you see the window which shows our fleet in the nice calm weather and A-OK. Over to the right you see the Spanish fleet in weather that can certainly not be described as OK. And this interesting little tableau is actually a real thing that happened. When we set sail and we're there and ready and waiting for them and going after them, the weather was fair. And all of a sudden, particularly when the battle did start to go against the Spanish a bit, the weather turned and a wind blew many of the Spanish ships onto the rocks and the cliffs, and those ships that we said were destroyed, that's how a lot of them were destroyed, and many lives were lost like that. Really, had that wind not happened, we may possibly well have lost, because we were vastly outnumbered by the Spanish. But at the time, and this is the reason this portrait was painted as well, it was said that God must be a Protestant God rather than a Catholic one, because the wind blew in favour of the Protestants and against the Catholics, and it actually became known, especially in England, as the Protestant wind. And there are images and engravings at the time of the eye of God in the sky blowing down the Protestant wind to wreck the Spanish. So that's a little bit of the symbolism of that one. Elizabeth's got her hand on the globe here. You've got the Tudor Crown Imperial, which was destroyed in Oliver Cromwell's day, so that's a thing we will never see. But yeah, and that heads us on to, so don't forget, they were defeated on the 8th, the Spanish, and news and information didn't travel fast in those days. It didn't travel fast at all. So the English back on land were expecting an invasion possibly at any time. So an invasion force was gathered, and at the coast of Tilbury, that's where we pick up with our story again, with Elizabeth. She, against advice, rode to Tilbury to meet her troops, and there she gave the greatest speech of her reign, that is known as the Tilbury speech. And this is really the speech that made the Queen. It absolutely made her. Unfortunately, her actions afterwards, not so much, but the speech certainly was a memorable thing that has never been forgotten. And what we're going to see next is Queen Elizabeth's Tilbury speech, a copy of it dating from that time, and I'll read it out to you myself. Queen Elizabeth's Tilbury speech to the troops at Tilbury was delivered on the 9th of August in the old calendar, 19th of August in the new style calendar, 1588, by Queen Elizabeth I of England, to the land forces earlier assembled at Tilbury in Essex in preparation for repelling the expected invasion by the Spanish Armada. And this is that speech, and I'm going to read to you now the very words of Queen Elizabeth I herself, which I think is very apt on the 420th anniversary of her death. Here we go, these are her words. We have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed of how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects, and therefore I am come amongst you, as you see at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of battle to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God, my kingdom, and for my people, my honour and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body of but a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and thinks foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any such prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonour shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. I know already for your forwardness you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you by the word of a prince, they shall be duly paid. In the meantime, my lieutenant general shall be in my stead, than whomever prince commanded more noble or worthy a subject, not doubting by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the camp, and your valour in the field, we shall surely have a famous victory over these enemies of my God, of my kingdom, and of my people. Well, and after that lot, you can well imagine, to a fairly uneducated population, they went absolutely mad, and she was a popular queen anyway, so we can imagine the cheers could be heard from miles and miles away, apparently. Yeah, and that's Queen Elizabeth I's famous Tilbury speech. Unfortunately, afterwards, with the you shall be rewarded, Queen Elizabeth didn't stick to her word, I'm afraid. When the fleet returned, she didn't discharge them. She said for fear of the Spaniards returning, which she knew couldn't happen because they'd been destroyed to a point where they wouldn't be able to return for at least 1 or 2 years. The reason that she would not discharge them is that she knew she would have to pay them. And Queen Elizabeth I was every bit as tight-fisted and parsimonious as her grandfather, King Henry VII. And she didn't want to have to pay all that money, and possibly may not have had it out of the royal coffers to pay. So that's why she didn't discharge them. And it caused an outcry. Even with Drake and some of the upper courtiers went to the Queen and pleaded the case, and she still didn't discharge them. And in the end, Drake and courtiers and people like that, out of their own pockets and purse, had to sub up money to try and pay some of these men, so they didn't end up completely all dying, because that's what happened. They were stuck at home on their ships, not discharged, and dying of disease and want, basically. So yeah, Elizabeth didn't stick to her promise there, I'm afraid. With the Armada, a little interesting fact that isn't much known about: the expedition of the Spanish Armada was the largest engagement of the undeclared Anglo-Spanish War. This is the interesting fact that not everyone knows about, and I didn't myself, to be honest with you. The following year, England organised a similar large-scale campaign against Spain, the English Armada, sometimes called the Counter Armada, which you're seeing an image of here, of 1589, which was also a complete failure. Old King Philip of Spain. And that concludes the Spanish Armada, which we see here with an original image, also taken from the Queen's house at Greenwich, same as the Armada portrait. These two portraits, the Queen's portrait and this portrait, look at each other in the same room. And that concludes the Armada. And here we see the great Queen Bess dressed in all her finery. She became known as Good Queen Bess, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. A very, very popular woman, particularly after this moment. And this portrait, if you want to look it up online, it's called the Armada portrait, and it is packed full of so much symbolism that would probably just require a video in itself, including one on the Tudor Crown Imperial, which no longer exists. So that, my dear friends, is the Spanish Armada, which takes us on to our next part of the video in a moment, which is Queen Elizabeth's greatest loss, which is the death of her favourite, some say brotherly friend and some say lover, Lord Rober Dudley. So join me for that part now. And now on to the greatest tragedy of Queen Elizabeth I's life, less than 1 month after her greatest victory of the Spanish Armada. It was her greatest tragedy. The death of her beloved Lord Rober Dudley, Earl of Leicester, long-time courtier, master of the horse, who arranged a lot of things. Other than that, he had to arrange the Queen's horses, not just for the Queen, but transport for the court. It wasn't just a sinecure, this position he was given. There was a lot involved in it, and he was a skilled man with horses. He knew what he was doing. He really knew what he was doing, Rober Dudley. Yeah, we're seeing him in his prime here in this image, and this image here. But by 1588, Dudley was a man in his late 50s, which was quite old for a Tudor man in those days. When a lot of men died in their 40s, that was fairly old. And he was no longer in his prime, and he'd grown quite corpulent and quite unhealthy. But Dudley's last great triumph had been to stage manage Elizabeth's famous visit to the troops at Tilbury Camp, when she made her famous speech, the "I have the heart and the stomach of a king" speech. Well, less than 1 month later, Dudley was worn out and possibly suffering from stomach cancer. On the 28th of August, pardon me, an ill Rober Dudley, Earl of Leicester, wrote his final letter to his Queen and childhood friend, Elizabeth I. He wrote it from the home of Lady Norreys at Ryecote, where he was staying on his way to Buxton to take the waters there. Taking the waters at Buxton was a restorative cure that the Tudors used, as well as many people use today. And he was on his way there. The wording of the letter and the fact that he was on his way to take the waters suggests that he had been ill for some time, which may lean towards the stomach cancer theory. But yeah, we're going to go on to the letter now, which, as I say, was written on the 28th of August 1588, and you're going to hear the last communication between Elizabeth I, or between Rober Dudley and Elizabeth I, her greatest favourite and greatest friend, and a man that many say she looked on as her brother, and some say she looked on as her lover. But that we'll never know, and out of respect, especially on this day, her anniversary, we'll call it a brotherly relationship. So on to the letter. 28th of August 1588. The spelling is a bit not great, bless him, so I shall read the translation for you. I most humbly beseech your majesty to pardon your poor old servant to be thus bold in sending to know how my gracious lady doth, and to see what ease of her late pains she finds. The Queen had been suffering from a sore leg, being the chiefest thing in the world that I do pray for her to have good health and long life. For my own poor case, I continue still your medicine, and find that it amends me much better than with any other thing that hath been given me. Thus hoping to find a perfect cure at the bath, with the continuance of my wonted prayer for your majesty's most happy preservation, I humbly kiss your foot. From your old lodging at Ryecote, this Thursday morning, ready to take on my journey, by your majesty's faithful and obedient servant, R. Leicester. He added a postscript. Even as I had writ thus much, I received your majesty's token by young Tracy. We don't know what the token was. Leicester died at his lodge at Cornbury, near Woodstock in Oxfordshire, while still on his way to Buxton on the 4th of September 1588. He was 56 years old. A grieving Elizabeth, grieving for a best friend and brother, as she described, barricaded herself into her chambers, seeing nobody. She treasured his final letter, the hurried message he'd inscribed to her, and it was obviously such a treasured thing. Robert's last words to his queen, and this is the copy of it that is at the National Archive. It is the original. And when Elizabeth died, this letter was found in a little box next to her bed, tucked away nicely. And you can see in Robert's hand, which is the bolder hand, the address to the Queen. And below that is the hand of Queen Elizabeth I. And once she'd sealed this letter up, she inscribed on the back of it, his last letter. So this was a very personal thing for her, and they were friends for a very long time. They grew old together in an age where many people didn't grow old. So you can imagine how she treasured this letter, and probably how much it grieved her as well, which is probably why it was sealed away in a little box and was only found because no one rifled through the Queen's things without her knowing, of course. It was only found after she died in the box by her bed, but it has to be wondered because she had pictures and little miniatures of Robert that when she was alone as a queen could be in those days, because a queen or a monarch was never truly alone, if she did look at the letter from time to time and the miniature and think of her old friend that she'd loved so dearly and that had been through so much. She'd forgiven Lord Robert a lot in their time, a lot, and he'd forgiven her much as well. It was a pretty feisty friendship. Robert wanted to marry the Queen. That could never happen after the Amy Dudley situation, as we discussed. Robert later on went on to marry Lottis, or Lettice Knollys, or Knowles, as the modern pronunciation is said. And that, it was kept secret for a while, and then an ambassador who was no friend of Robert Dudley's let it slip to the Queen that Lord Robert Dudley is married, and the Queen went into a rage, literally beat Robert Dudley and tore at him with her fingernails and everything, screamed the place down, locked herself in her room, and it is reputed that when she came out of the room and said, "If anyone breathes a word of this, you die." So that sounds pretty much like Elizabeth I. But she forgave him that, but she never ever liked Lettice Knollys, his second wife. But that marriage is what takes us on to our next story, or next phase of the story. This woman and Robert, when they married, she already had a child, Robert Devereux, first Earl of Essex as he would become, who became Lord Robert's stepson. He was raised up as Lord Robert's stepson, and that's what I want to lead you on to now. He would be the last great favourite, and he would be the last betrayal in Queen Elizabeth's life. So let's head on to that bit of the story now. And that leads us on to Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex and Queen Elizabeth I's last great favourite, stepson of Robert Dudley. And as I've discussed before, that she forgave him very, very much, and probably because he was her last link to Robert Dudley. So there we are. But Essex's rebellion was an unsuccessful rebellion led by Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, in 1601 against Queen Elizabeth I and Sir Robert Cecil, which was William Cecil, Lord Burleigh's son, and the man that replaced William Cecil as Chief Minister. And Cecil's faction and supporters, so Essex could gain further influence at court Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was the main leader of the Essex Rebellion in 1601. The main tensions led to the rebellion. They began in 1599, when Essex was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He was sent to Ireland with the mission of subduing the revolts led by Tyrone, leading one of the largest expeditionary forces ever sent to that country. It was expected that Essex would crush the rebellion immediately, but he fought a series of inconclusive battles, squandered his funds, and was unable to face the Irish in any sort of engagement. Given these difficulties, Essex eventually made a truce with Tyrone. This truce was seen as a disgrace to England and the challenge to the authority of those in power. He proceeded to leave Ireland and returned to England. His time spent as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland proved disastrous to him. His return was in repressed defiance of the orders of the Queen herself. She spoke out on his behaviour, calling it perilous and contemptible. Essex was deprived of his offices in June 1600 and promptly placed under house arrest. His ambition had been to direct an anti-Habsburg foreign policy for England, while covertly facilitating the accession of James I of Scotland to the English throne, which is something Elizabeth never forgave him for, because she did not even like the talking of who would come after her. One of her sayings is, "More will favour the rising than the setting sun," which is why she didn't name an heir till the very last moment. Essex's loss of position at court fueled his sense of grievance towards the Cecil faction. This may have made him fearful of assassination attempts and suspicious of a Sicilian policy of seeking peace with Spain. In disgrace, as well as in political and financial ruin, Essex wrote several letters of submission to the Queen, and by August 1600 he was able to move freely except to return to court. He spent further time sending letters in an attempt to gain permission to do so. In November 1600 the Queen refused to renew his government-granted monopoly on sweet wine, an action that placed Essex in even deeper financial difficulties. The sweet wine thing was a political saga. They were little favours that she granted to her friends, and the people didn't like it, so as to placate the people, she took away his grant and gained herself favour, but screwed things up for Essex, left him in even deeper financial difficulties. He began to create plans to seize the country by force. What happened is he rode back to the court and went into the court caked in mud, and went to the Queen's bedchamber caked in mud and filth. And let's not forget the hours-long makeup routine of Elizabeth I to make her look as she wanted to appear. Without all that makeup, bearing in mind she was an old lady by this point, going bald, pock-marked, and he burst into her bedroom and saw Elizabeth I without all her makeup and her wigs and gown and everything. The only people to see her like that were her ladies, and Elizabeth I was furious and of course humiliated, because Essex had never seen her like that, and the look of shock on his face must have said it all, really. Anyway, he stormed out the room and went, but he was called to a council meeting and asked to explain himself. And Robert Cecil, the new chief minister, went to say something and said the Queen's conditions, and Devereux here cut him off and went, the Queen's conditions are as crooked and cankered as her carcass, as a little dig to what he'd seen in that room, and it got back to the Queen, and some say that sealed his fate. He was her favourite, and she forgave him a hell of a lot indeed. But this last rebellion and the crooked and cankered as her carcass comment cut her to the quick, and she was every inch her father's daughter and didn't forgive something when someone really got her. So being a queen, she could get you back, which leads us to here. Essex himself even admitted in his execution speech, and when he spoke to others, that he had to die. The Queen wasn't safe while he was alive. And part of his execution speech, part of the thing of a gentleman of those days, if you were going to go to the block, you did it with style, to give a good speech of good flourish and whatnot and all that business. And part of his speech was that the sins were greater in number than the hairs on his head. And that was a little part of it. But anyway, on the 25th of February 1601, Essex was beheaded in the confines of the Tower of London, and there buried in an unmarked grave inside the church of St Peter ad Vincula. And that so ends the Essex Rebellion and the last betrayal against Queen Elizabeth I. Hope you've all found this episode interesting. Join me again soon for the next part, which will cover